Today's scripture reading is from Hebrews 11:8-19. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder was God. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants, as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. These all died by faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they have been thinking of that land of which they had gone out, they would have had an opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them, a city. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was in act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, "Through Isaac shall your offspring be named." He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back.
So you get to help me this morning formulate my introduction. I do have one. It's good to have you here. You doing good? Yeah, sweet. Think with me, what's something like an event that you would have that's going to require a bit of longevity, and you have to prepare in a number of different ways to make sure that you can endure the whole event? I have one. I just don't always want to use the ones that first come to my mind. Can you think of something like that? A wedding. Yeah. Oh my goodness. I'm gonna just go with mine. These are good. What's another one? Life. Wow, yeah, that is a large event that requires a lot of preparation. Let's grab one of those. Life and fatherhood are a bit too large, I think, for our example. If we think of a wedding, you're thinking of a dress, cake, maybe go back a little bit, you got rings, vows, suits for the men, right? So you're like, there's this event, and for this event to occur, it's a little different in this sense because the walk of faith, like the whole thing is a walk of faith. In a wedding, you're like looking to this end. But in essence, the preparation for this wedding, food for the meal, couple meals maybe. I think that's a good illustration. One, I was thinking of a bike ride. Andy went on a long bike ride, and I started thinking of all these different things like granola bars that make sure you have, and water, to make sure you've taken that, and that you've actually practiced enough to be able to go the distance that you want to go. So you think of these things that require longevity to some degree, and you have to prepare for them. So you don't look at this, even though it's one event, it actually requires a lot of different things going on, okay? And I want you to wrap your head a little bit around that as we think of some sketches of faith. Let's step into my message this morning of 7-point message. Right? I usually go a good 40 minutes in 3, so we'll be going a couple hours this morning. Ernest is excited about it, I know. No, quickly, brief. Maybe I should have titled it Brief Sketches of Faith from the Life of Abraham. We've had the passage read to us, but I don't know why I'm down here this morning, but we're just sticking with it. Hebrews 11, we've already discuss the definition of faith in the first few verses. You look at Abel and Enoch in the next few verses. You get to Noah by the time you get to verse 7. And then you have Noah gets one verse, and then Abraham and Sarah go from 8 to 19. We're going to look at this text, and what I'd like to do this morning, we could have 7 messages on this text. We're not going to. We're going to have one. And we're going to draw 7 brief sketches of lessons that we need to think of as far as we want to endure this life of faith. What are the things that we need to consider? Okay? So I'm just going to give them to you. I'm not going to comment long on them. I think they're fairly self-explanatory. But before we jump into the 7 sketches, let me remind you, what is our definition of faith? What does it involve? Typically 3 things. We've kind of nuanced it a little bit. But what does faith involve, as we've talked about it the last couple weeks? It is a gift. Defining faith. Involves that? Okay, yes. So there's this presumption before we get to the definition of faith that God has communicated something. We mentally assent to that thing that has been communicated. But it's not just mental assent. It's not that I just simply understand what he said, but I actually personally, internally embrace that truth that has been communicated by God. And true faith results in action or obedience to that thing which was communicated by God. Okay, so that has been our definition of faith from the first 3 verses in essence. And you see that again in verses 8 and 9. Let me read those for you once again. Chapter 11, verse 8, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go to a place. Who called him? God gives him revelation. Go. He obeyed. It's not in the same order all the time, our understanding of faith. So, by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive an inheritance. And he did what? He went. That is faith. God communicated. He understood what was supposed to be done. He internally accepted that, obviously, because it manifests in his obedience. He went out. So just reiterating our definition of faith once again in the life of Abraham. But we've come to our first sketch in the life of Abraham. And our first point that we see is that faith's obedience looks different for everybody. God calls Abraham to go. But not all are called to go. Right? I think sometimes we often determine what faith should look like by the people that we have determined are the best at it. Right? That's a person of faith. That's what faith should look like. And somehow we impose falsely on them, like we have to be like that. I remember growing up, there were a lot of illustrations given of missionaries and how long people would pray or how often people would have devotions or how long they would have devotions. And I imposed that, like, for me to be a spiritual person like that, I have to look the same way as them. And I felt shame whenever I didn't look like that person. 3 hours of a prayer life in the morning. Like, only godly people do that. And I'm like, I don't even know what to pray. I must not be as godly as them. Or the godly people, they go and they go out and they do these certain things and they sacrifice these certain ways, and I wasn't doing that, and I felt shame, like I probably am not submissive to God's will. And yet, you know what's interesting? As I considered the people so far in our sketch, Abraham's the first one that we're aware of that was supposed to go anywhere. Abel couldn't, for obvious reasons. Enoch, we don't have a clue. I know with certainty, Noah, I'm pretty sure Noah wasn't moving around with the ark. Right? Like basically God said, Noah, stay there, live there. for 100 years. I don't know about the previous 500 or the following 300, but live there and build this ark. That's what I want you to do. That's what I want you to do. Obedience for Noah looked different than obedience for Abraham. We need to make sure that we're aware of that. Let me add a pastoral note. I am trying to purposefully release you from feeling like your faith has to look the same as the people you've deemed to be the most godly in your life. God is going to work different in you, and that's okay. It's a good thing you're not all pastors, right? God needs you potentially right exactly where he has you. And you should be good with that. Now let me add a second pastoral note. Because that's true, or maybe I say it this way, even though that is true, it's possible too many of us are staying. I'm not trying to impose on you something that is not meant to be imposed on you by God, but I do think if we err one way or the other, we potentially err on the side of God desiring for us to do things and us not accepting it because we don't want to. So don't take on the form of someone else's faith, but make sure that you're doing what he has called you to do. So my concern is not so much whether you're going or staying in the future. Often this faith walk is this, like, what does God have for me out here? We're thinking, like, in 5 years, what does God have for me? The question is not, what does God have for you in 5 years? It's, obey today. I know this with certainty. It is God's will that you're all in Waterloo this morning with the people that you're sitting near, with the intentions of obeying him and glorifying and reflecting his character to the people that you're with. That is not hard to know. It's hard to do, it's not hard to know. God's will for your life today is love these people and the people you will come in contact with. He might have something for you different in 5 years, I don't know, but I know what he wants for you today. And it's going to look different for you. Faith obedience looks different for everyone. The second one we find in 11, 8, and 9. Let me read those to you, emphasizing just a couple things, and it's that faith may be properly motivated by reward. Faith may be properly motivated by reward. Look at verses 8 and 9. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. Look at the emphasis here. What was it that was prompting Abraham in this text? It was the promise of an inheritance, right? And you keep going. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise. So I'm going to this place that's been promised to me as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. Simple point I'm just making is I think sometimes we can tend to think that our faith being motivated by reward is selfish. Nowhere in the text does it say, Abraham, obey simply out of obedience and reverence for God. Now, should that be true of Abraham? Of course. Of course, Abraham ought to desire to obey. That should be his internal desire, whether he gets anything out of it or not. He ought to desire, as we all should, to glorify God by reflecting and declaring his character every moment of our lives. That ought to be the driving factor in our lives all the time. But that's not what the emphasis is here. And also, sometimes we can feel like it's wrong to be motivated by reward. And yet it seems as if God uses this promise of an inheritance, of multiple children, this land, as a motivator for Abraham's obedience. It's okay for you, in its appropriate balance, to be driven in this endeavor of faith, to be driven to endure through hardship, knowing that there's something that God's going to do for you in the future. Consistently throughout Scripture, we see him set things in front of us to be driven by. There's this experience of heaven waiting you. There's this moment, there's this perfection, there's the deliverance from sin, there's forgiveness and deliverance from this broken creation. There's, in essence, the land that you'll receive someday. And that's okay to be motivated by that when it's coupled with a desire to glorify God. So first, obedience looks different in each of us. Our faith's obedience looks different in every one of us. Secondly, faith is properly motivated by reward. Third, faith extends through death. Simple sentence, the beginning of verse 13. These all died in faith. There's some debate as to who these refers to. I don't want to take more than 20 seconds to explain it. It could be all of the people in chapter 11, except for that Enoch didn't. So I don't think it is all the people in chapter 11. It could be all the people prior to this verse: Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah. Except for that, it seems to be specifically discussing them seeing something from afar, them having this promise given to them. I think it's specifically Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Sarah. The people that's being spoken of in verses 8 through 19, these people, they all died in faith, which means what? That in our walk of faith, for every one of us, endurance is going to require our faith to last through our death. None of you are going to get the fulfillment of the promise prior to it. You're going to have to push through that one final thing. That's a tough one. You will never see the promise materialized in your life. We'll get to that in a second. You'll see it in one sense, but you will not have the promises ultimately fulfilled in this life. And so faith is going to require that you get all the way to the end of your life, still not seeing it, and die with the hope that behind that veil of death, those promises will be fulfilled. Faith requires that. The kind of faith that God gives his people, that's how it works out. Their endurance of faith pushes through death. Fourth, we see it in verse 13 as well. Faith includes symbolic sight. And I say symbolic, maybe there's a better word for that. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. I put in there, I don't know if you can read it well, this sight is an eye of faith, not a present experience of physical sight. They didn't see the promise fulfilled. The phrase, I can see it, like, have you ever, someone's trying to paint a word picture for you, and you're like, I can see it. Like, it's in your mind's eye, like this reality. Like, they've painted it so clearly that even though it's not material and it's not real in front of you, you have this objective sight of this thing. Right? In essence, this is what faith is. I have never seen Christ, but I kind of feel like I have. Like I get weepy as I think of death and seeing Christ. I'm overwhelmed by knowing that after that veil, this sinful, broken world and my utterly sinful and broken self goes on to another side where sin is no more for me. Like I can see it. I can see a new creation. I can see a new heaven and a new earth. I can see Christ reigning instead of all of the absolute fools who reign here. I can see it. But it's eyes of faith. It's not something that obviously is material that I can actually see with my physical eyes, but man, I can see it. And that sight is driving me to go through whatever it is that's happening now, because I see this thing that God has painted for us in His Word, and it is beautiful and glorious. I can see it. 5. Faith makes us strangers in this world. He develops this probably the most. You see it in verses 9 and 10, and I'm not exactly sure why he did this. We could debate it pointlessly. Then he talks about Sarah and Abraham, 11 and 12, and then he goes to 13 through 16, and he talks about the same concept of 9 and 10 again. Let me read them for you, and keep in mind this idea of being a stranger and an alien in this place, earth. By faith Abraham went to live in the land of promise as in a foreign land, living in tents. So he sets up this thing, two things. One, I'm a foreigner in this place and I don't have any permanence. I'm living in a tent. So he owns no property. There, in essence, I'll use this word because it'll come up in just a second. There's no foundation for him. I'm an alien, and I have no foundation for a home, for a life. Okay? Back to 9. By faith, Abraham went to live in the land of promise as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. So what he was equipped to endure two things. One, being a stranger, and two, having no foundation. Because of why? For what reason? What prompted him, motivated him through a life of being a stranger with no foundation of life? Because he saw what? He saw a city whose foundation was built by God, and that was his. He had been made, a promise was given to Abraham, and he saw it. He knew it was out there. And God was the builder and architect and foundation of that place where he would not be a stranger and an alien, but he would be part of the people. It would be his place, and he would be part of that group of people. He would be God's people in God's land on a solid foundation. So he was able to, for a lifetime, to wander in a place that was not his, in a place that he was an alien, in a place he owned no land, and he had to buy a property just to bury his wife. He put up with all of that as a stranger and an alien with no foundation because he saw the place that he would be part of the people of God and have a place with God. This is what Paul in Romans 8:18. Let me read this for you. A little lengthy passage, but it says the same thing. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits presently with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected back in Genesis 3 to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free. So in someday, the creation itself is going to be set free from bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. Verse 22, for we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit, we groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. Now, hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. We have this moment. Right now, all of creation, you and all of creation groans, desiring for that moment to come. And it is in that moment that we hope. It is in that moment that we place our faith. We look forward to it. It's what drives us and gives us endurance through suffering and hardship. So fifth, faith makes us strangers and aliens in this world. 6, in faith we experience God's divine enabling. Hebrews 11 through 12, one of the funnier verses in the text. Maybe not what you were expecting, but let's read about Abraham, who was pretty much dead. 11, and I'm going to say this up front, and then we'll wrestle with this just for a couple minutes, because I think there's some value that can come from the wrestling match with this verse. This verse is translated different like in every version. It's a very confusing verse, and that's seen if you were just to read 10 different versions, you'd see some variance in this. Let me read it from the ESV. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. That's the verse that's debated. Not so much this one. Therefore, from one man, Abraham, and him as good as dead, were born descendants, as many as the stars of heaven and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. Now, if you were to read the ESV, the question really is this, and this is somewhat academic, so bear with me just for a second, because I think there's some value to this. Go ahead and go to that next slide. If you read, the question is, who's the subject of the verse? Is this Abraham's faith or Sarah's faith? And who's the one who was given the ability to procreate? Abraham or Sarah? And you might be like, who cares, both of them? Just bear with me for a second, okay? So if you read the Net Bible, you have by faith, even though Sarah herself was barren and he was too old, he received the ability to procreate, because he regarded the one who had given the promise to be trustworthy. So in this, verse 8 through 11 is all about Abraham, right? We've only talked about Abraham so far. It's only here in verse 11 here that all of a sudden Sarah comes into the story. And then he goes back to talking about Abraham again in verse 17, by faith Abraham. So there's an interruption of flow, so some argue that it seems awkward that he's going from Abraham, Sarah, Abraham, which I don't think that's that big of a deal. They're married, so it makes sense that they'd be together. The problem with this is the word for procreate only makes sense of the man, without getting into any further explanation for that. Okay? So the ability to procreate seems clearly to be talking about Abraham. Let me ask you this, as Linda and I were having a good conversation about this yesterday, but she's like, yeah, but you have to go back to Genesis to really appreciate this story, and we're going to in just a second. But you see the conundrum here if you read the NAS as well. By faith, even Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. So which one is it, and does it matter? No, it does, but let's get there in a second. Let's go to Genesis 18. You have the story really starting in 16. Let me engage you a little bit because you had breakfast before you came in here, and some of you are about to fall asleep. So, what are some odd things that, and don't answer, just think, and then I'll remind you of some of the story of Abraham. What are some odd things that Abraham and Sarah go through in this journey of the promise of Isaac coming? Do you remember some of them? Dennis. Yeah, like 2 different places he lies about it being his sister. Like, go over there, I don't want them to hurt me. You must be attractive for some reason, so she must be for him to think that they're going to just take her. Seems weird. Just go, and yeah, that they do that. That's unusual. Yes. So a promise has been made in chapter 12 that Abraham would have a child and become the father of a multitude of nations. This is covenanted with him in 15 and 17. And they're getting old, and Sarah's like, I'm not sure that this is going to happen. Hey, Hagar, or Abraham, why don't you take Hagar and have a child with her? It was Sarai at that time's servant. Well, okay, that's sketchy, right? Am I the only one thinking that? That seems off. Well, the second part of it's off too. He's like, sure. Right, that's a problem. Like, okay. And they have a kid. And then Sarai's response to this is what? Well, I hate you. Why don't you go in the wilderness and die? That's isn't that basically what she says? You may not remember this. I did not remember this. Sarah sends Hagar into the wilderness twice. Right when Ishmael is born because she's upset about it. And when he's 13, and Isaac is born, she doesn't want nothing to do with Ishmael and Hagar and sends them into the wilderness again. And both times God cares for them. This is sketchy story stuff. This would be a good movie, right? And then there's one other one that comes up. I could read the text, but let's talk through it here. 3 men come to Abraham. He's in his tent. He comes out and he greets them. It's funny, like Sarah's hiding behind the curtain of the tent door. Remember this? And the Lord tells Abraham, you're going to have a child. In a year, I'm going to come back and you'll have a child. And what does Sarah do? Laughs. This makes me laugh, if I can find this quick, because I don't know that I'll say it right. 9 through 15 in chapter 18. I'll just read that quickly. Then said to him, where is Sarah, your wife? And he said, she's in the tent. The Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. Look up that and study that phrase for a little bit. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I'm worn out, and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? I don't think this is going to happen. Like, we've not been intimate for a while. I don't see this happening. That's what that's saying. The Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? And that's the point of my point right here, right? At the appointed time, I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son. Sarah denied it, saying, I didn't laugh. He said, no, but you did laugh. I love this story. Without going into any further detail, trying to explain it, I do think that the emphasis is on by faith Sarah, because every other instance in this chapter, it's the same order, by faith and a person, and it talks about something that occurs because of their faith. So I think it's by faith, because of Sarah's faith, Abraham was able to procreate, and she was able to receive it. That, I think, is what it is. Now, why, you might be saying, Aaron, you said you were going to make this practical and tell us why it mattered. Let me tell you this. If we were just to focus on Abraham, and it was always Abraham's faith in this text, You might struggle a little bit connecting to Abraham. Abraham, as Paul says, is the father of faith. He's like the penultimate example of faith. If you look at him, you're like, kind of sketchy, but it seems like a lot of it starts with Sarah. Okay? Her and Eve. Man. Anyway. But Abraham is the father of faith. He's an exemplar of the faith. We should look to him as a role model to some degree, right? Would you think to look at Sarah as a role model of faith? I don't think so. Like all of the stories that mention it, it's like, man, Sarah, like what are you thinking? Like, I wouldn't do that. You gave your servant to your husband. You lied to the Lord. You laughed because you don't believe him. It says that she laughed because she doesn't believe. Like, how is that an example of faith? And you know what it did to my heart? God, his gracious gift of faith, he imparts to all kinds of people. And Abraham is a beautiful model of it. And you know what? Sarah is a model that maybe a lot of us relate to more than we would Sarah. We feel like, I struggle with my faith. It is weak. And the manifestations of my faith often in life are pretty questionable. And yet, it seems to clearly say, if we could look past and knew Sarah beyond just the stories that are given to us, the few stories in Genesis basically 12 through 22, if we could know more of her, she was a person of faith. And sometimes she fumbled the ball seriously. That is encouraging to me. But the point primarily to take away from this is that if God has called you to something, so go ahead and go to, I think, point 6. If God has called you to something, he enables you to do that which he's called you to do. And God waited till the last minute so that he could prove he was the one empowering this. Right? Sarah went through menopause long ago. Abraham was done producing seed. They were in their hundreds or around 100. Sexual intimacy was not something that was part of their married life right now. I can't have any more pleasure. I'm old and wrinkled. That's what the text says in one version. I'm old and wrinkled. I can't have any more pleasure. How is this going to happen? And it's like God's like, I'm going to wait till the absolute last second to allow this to happen so that I can make a point that when I make a promise, I will enable the people I've called to this task to do it. If he calls you to something, which he has, he's empowering you to do it. So step up in faith and do it. I don't know what it is for you, but do it. 7, and we're done with this. 7, in faith we sacrifice without loss of hope. 17 through 19, we come back to Abraham, and we see Abraham, by faith, offered Isaac. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son. He was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. So this is a sacrifice. He was making an actual sacrifice, Abraham was. But he had every expectation that God would still fulfill his promise through Isaac. So he goes on to say, he considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Abraham just assumed he was going to kill Isaac. That's faith. He also assumed God would raise Isaac from the dead. That's amazing. This is going to be a rough day, but pretty amazing. I mean, it seemed like Abraham is like, we got to do this thing, but this is going to be crazy. We got some pretty supernatural stuff going on later today or soon. What conversations did he have with Isaac? Don't worry about it. You'll be back. I don't know, but he was willing to sacrifice in the present because he had every expectation. His hope was undeterred about what God had promised. God had said, I'm going to make you a great nation through this specific son, Isaac. And he had every expectation that God would do it. I don't know what sacrifices you have to make. Let me just say, just in case you were struggling, it's not a literal sacrifice. Please don't engage in that. No one's asking you to make an actual sacrifice. But you're letting go of something. You're sacrificing something. You're sacrificing your time, your heart, your emotions, your friendship, your home, your money, what people think of you. I don't know what it is. And it's easy when we, in the present, feel like I have to offer this sacrifice. And if I do this thing for God, I'm going to lose X, Y, and Z. For me to feel like, well, God, are you going to do your part? You've made these promises, and I'm a little concerned about those promises because you're now requiring these sacrifices. And yet the faith that God imparts to you, it endures through the sacrifice with every expectation that God will fulfill the promise and the hope that he has extended to you. So, as we have reiterated the last couple of weeks, you can't produce this kind of faith. This is not a faith that you conjure up, that you can work hard at, and you can just, by hard work, you can get great faith. This is the kind of faith that God imparts to his people. The kind of faith that God imparts to his people looks different in each of us. Our obedience looks different in each of us. The kind of faith that God imparts to us is prompted often and motivated by desire or by our reward. The kind of faith that God extends to us goes right through death, that veil. The kind of faith that God extends to you has symbolic sight, but not physical sight in the present. The kind of faith that God extends to you makes you strange. You're a stranger in the world. You don't fit here. You don't belong. The kind of faith that God imparts to us as his people, he empowers us to do. And the kind of faith that God gives us pushes through the sacrifices required of us with no fear of loss of the fulfillment, or with every expectation that God will fulfill. Abraham, Sarah, beautiful examples. I encourage you to meditate on each of those things as we consider endurance of faith through a life. All of those things are part of it. And meditate on them to see, are those part of my life? Is that how I'm responding in faith?
Father, we thank you for today. We thank you for the gift of faith, Lord. Pray that you would help us study your word so we understand what that means to us and how we live and apply it. We thank you for this message today that laid out some things for us to think through and ponder and apply. Again, we thank you so much for your sacrifice through your Son on the cross. Pray that you would help us strive to live lives worthy of being called Christian this week, and that we would be salt and light for you wherever you have us. In Jesus' name, amen.